"I can pay you 3 shillings a week and your board," the young woman said, looking him over with more nerve than she could truly have felt. "And I warn you plainly, sir, the men who want to frighten me are gentlemen, and they will not fight fair. If that turns your stomach, there is the door." Sebastian, Duke of Draymoor, who had walked into the registry office under the plain name of Mr. Vale, in a plain brown coat with a plain man's calloused hands, he had spent a month acquiring, inclined his head and said, "Then it is well I have no stomach to turn, miss. When do I begin?" And that was how the most powerful man in 3 counties came to be hired as a hired guard by Clarice Harrow, who thought him nobody at all. He had not intended any of it. He had come to that grim little market town of Ashbourne on a matter of his own, a cousin's debts, a swindle he meant quietly to break, and had taken to walking the streets in disguise because a duke's carriage sees nothing and a plain man sees everything. It was as a plain man that he had first noticed her, a slight, straight-backed young woman coming out of a lawyer's office with her chin up and her hands shaking, followed at a careful distance by 2 men who were plainly not friends. He had followed the followers, old habit. He had learned, in a war and in a great deal of money, to notice who follows whom. What he pieced together over the next days he did not like at all. Clarice Harrow was the last of a small landed family, orphaned, and she had inherited from her father a modest but stubborn little property called Wickfield, modest to a duke, a fortune to the men who wanted it. Chief among these was a Mr. Cathan Rook, a smiling, well-dressed money-lender with pretensions to gentility, to whom her late father had owed money, and who had decided that the neatest way to settle the debt was to marry the daughter and swallow the land. Clarice had refused him. And so the accidents had begun. A gate left open and her horse spooked. A stone through her window in the night. A man in the lane who put his hand to her bridle and smiled and said it would be a pity, a young lady alone, if something were to happen. She had gone to the magistrate, who happened to dine with Rook. She had gone to the lawyer, who advised her, kindly, to marry and be safe, and then she had put up a plain card in the registry office. Wanted, an able man, discreet for the protection of a lady's person and property. Sebastian could have crushed Cathan Rook with a letter. A word from the Duke of Draymoor, and the man's credit would have evaporated, his loans called, his pretensions laughed out of every drawing-room in the county. He thought about doing exactly that, riding to Ashbourne as himself, and he found, turning it over on the walk back to his inn, that he did not want to, not yet. He wanted, for reasons he did not examine closely, to be no one to her. To be simply the man who stood between her and harm because she had asked him to, and not because he was the Duke of Draymoor and could do as he pleased. He had been the Duke of Draymoor his whole life. He had never once, in all that time, been chosen by a person who wanted nothing from him but that he keep her safe. So Mr. Vale took the 3 shillings and the board. He slept in the little room over the Wickfield stable and rose before the household and walked the boundaries at dawn, learning the land the way he had learned ground before a battle. He mended the broken gate himself, and the shutter, and taught the one old groom to bar the doors properly at night. He was quiet and watchful, and he did not presume. When Clarice gave him an order he touched his hat and obeyed it, and it cost him nothing, and something in him he had thought long since dead and curled a little in the sun of being ordinary. She watched him at first the way you watch a strange dog. Then, slowly, she stopped watching him and began simply talking to him in the evenings on the terrace while the light went, the way lonely people talk to the one safe person in their world. She told him about her father, who had been a good man and a poor one at figures. She told him about Wickfield, every field of it, in a voice that made clear she would die before she gave 1 acre of it to Cathan Rook. She told him she was afraid some nights, and said it plainly, without shame, and Sebastian, who had commanded men and cowed peers and had never in his life had a woman speak to him as though he were merely another human soul she trusted, found that these evenings had become the thing he lived the day for. "You do not talk like a hired man, Mr. Vale," she said once, narrowing her eyes at him over the failing light. "You talk like a man who has read a great many books and lost a great deal." "I have read a few," he said, "and lost some things, miss. Most men have by my age. Where did you serve?" Abroad. True enough. He had bought his own commission and led his own men and come home decorated and hollow. "I do not care to speak of it." She let it go, which was its own kindness, and he loved her a little for the letting go, and then had to sit very still for a moment because the word love had walked into his mind without knocking, and he did not know what to do with it in a plain brown coat. Catherine Rook did not care for the arrival of Mr. Vale. It became plain within a fortnight that the smiling moneylender had expected an easy siege and found instead a wall. His men no longer strolled the lanes of Wickfield unchallenged. Mr. Vale had a way of appearing, unhurried, at the moment they thought themselves unobserved, and looking at them with mild grey eyes, until remembered urgent business elsewhere. Twice Rook sent word offering to buy out the fellow's contract. Mr. Vale declined courteously and mentioned the offers to no one, and doubled the night watch. The thing came to its head on a wet October night. Sebastian had felt it coming the way he had once felt weather before a battle, a wrongness in the quiet. Rook's papers, he had learned by then through his own quiet inquiries, were rotten. The man had overlent himself in a dozen directions and needed Wickfield not for greed alone but for survival, and a cornered man is a dangerous one, so Sebastian did not sleep that night. He sat in the dark of the terrace with his back to the wall, and near midnight he heard, exactly as he had known he would, the soft scrape of men coming over the orchard wall, 3 of them, and one carrying, God help them, a lit brand shielded under his coat. They meant to burn her out. They never reached the house. Sebastian came out of the dark like the war he never spoke of. He took the man with the brand first, and put the fire out in the wet grass, and the other 2, discovering that the plain hired man moved like something they had no answer for, chose their lives over their orders and fled back over the wall. But the third, the brand man, came up with a knife. And there was a bad half-minute in the dark and the rain, and when it was over Rook's man was groaning in the mud with a broken arm, and Sebastian was on one knee in the wet with a long red line laid open across his forearm, breathing hard. And Clarice was there in the doorway with a lamp and her father's old pistol in 2 steady hands, having come down at the first shout. She got the wounded intruder tied and the groom sent for the constable, the honest one from the next town, not the magistrate who dined with Rook. And only then did she turn to Sebastian, who had risen and was leaning against the terrace pillar with his hand clamped over his arm, and the rain washing pink off his sleeve. She set down the lamp. She took his arm without asking, and pushed back the torn sleeve, and went white. And then did not faint or weep, but fetched water and clean linen and needle and thread with the grim competence of a country girl who had dressed worse hurts on livestock, and set about closing the wound by lamplight on the kitchen table while he sat and let her. It was there, in the yellow lamplight, with her bent close over his forearm and her hair coming loose against his cheek and her hands so careful and so unafraid, that the disguise ended, not because he chose the moment but because the moment chose him. She was tying off the last stitch when her fingers stilled. She had turned his hand a little to reach the wound, and the lamplight had fallen across his palm, and across a ring he had forgotten, that he never wore in company and had not thought to take off in the dark, a heavy old signet, pushed to the inside of his hand, worn smooth, cut with a crest she had seen before, on the magistrate's own letters, on the toll house at the county line, on the great gates 12 miles off that everyone in Ashbourne knew and no one had ever passed. Clarice went very still. "Draymoor," she said. Just the word. She lifted her eyes to his face and looked at it as though seeing it for the first time, the plain brown coat, the calloused hands, and behind them, now unmistakably, a man born to a title so far above her own that the distance was a kind of vertigo. This is the Draymoor crest. Every soul in this county knows the Draymoor crest. Her voice was not loud. That was somehow worse. "Who are you?" He might have lied even then. He found he could not, and did not want to. "My name is Sebastian," he said quietly. "I am the Duke of Draymoor. I came to Ashbourne on my own business, in disguise as I have done before, and I saw a man's hirelings following a woman in the street, and I followed them instead. And when I understood what was being done to you, I could have ended it with a letter, Clarice. One letter as myself, and Catherine Rook would be finished. I know it. I mean to write it tomorrow. The man is overlent, and I hold paper he cannot cover, and by Michaelmas he will be ruined, and you will be safe forever. I could have done it the first week." He stopped. His voice, when it went on, was not at a duke's voice at all. "I did not, because then I would have been Draymoor to you, and I did not want, God forgive me, to be Draymoor to you. I wanted to be the man you chose to keep you safe. I have been chosen for my title my whole life. You are the first person who ever chose me for nothing but my 2 hands. I could not bear to give that up. So I lied to you, and I am sorry, and I will understand if you never wish to see my face again." For a long moment she said nothing. The rain round the black window. Then she looked down at his bound arm, at the neat stitches her own fingers had set, and back up at his face, and Sebastian braced for the just and total anger of a proud woman deceived. "You let a man cut you open," she said low, "over a stone gate for 3 shillings a week, when you own half the county. Yes, you mended my orchard wall with your own hands. You a duke. But yes." Something in her mouth trembled, between fury and something else entirely. "I told you I was afraid at night," she said. "I told a duke I was afraid at night, as though he were a servant, and he touched his hat and doubled the watch and never once made me feel small for it." Her eyes filled, and she let them angrily. "Do you know how rare that is? Do you know what it is, to a woman with nothing, to be kept safe by a man who wants nothing? Tell me," he said, "and I will spend my life at it." Clarisse laughed, one broken breath of it, and pressed the back of her wrist to her eyes, and when she took it away she was looking at him differently, not up at a duke, and not across at a hired man, but straight at Sebastian, which was all he had ever wanted. "You are a great fool, your grace," she said, "and you have bled all over my clean table, and if you imagine I am going to marry Catherine Rook now that a duke has been mending my walls, you are an even greater one." "I would rather," Sebastian said, taking her hand in his good one, careless of the title now, careless of everything but the warm, competent hand that had just sewn him whole. "You married the Duke." Catherine Rook was ruined by Michaelmas, quietly and completely, and left the county owing everyone, and was never a danger to anyone again. But that was the least of it, and Sebastian barely troubled himself to watch it done. He courted Clarisse Harrow that winter as himself, as Mr. Vale, both. For she made him promise to keep the plain brown coat, and to mend things with his own hands, and to remember, when the great house and the great title threatened to swallow him again, the man he had been for one strange autumn when a fearless girl at a kitchen table had loved him for nothing but his 2 hands. They were married at Wickfield, which she would not give up for all of Draymoor, so he simply added it to nothing and let her keep every acre. And on the terrace, where she had once told a hired man she was afraid at night, the Duke of Draymoor sat beside his Duchess in the long evenings and was, for the first time in his titled life, entirely known, and entirely safe, and entirely home.